Good evening, good evening, good evening to the Macedonia AME and Accomack Church family and to our connectional listeners. We are grateful to all of you who are tapped in this evening across platforms. Please feel free to hit us up in the chat boxes and comment sections, meet each other virtually, and engage with one another. And what we hope will be a communal dialogue. As always, we will begin in prayer. So I invite you all to still yourselves and quiet yourselves for centering moment. Let us pray now together. God, who is a most mindful creator, we say thank you for being so mindful of us that you would allow us another opportunity to gather in your name, another opportunity to share this space and time with one another, and an opportunity to encounter fresh revelation. We ask that you would show up in this space with us, be the wisdom in the room. We ask that you would show up and be our memory. Call back to us all those things that may be relevant for us to share, that may be transformative for us to share, that may be empowering to these, your people. We ask that you speak to those who are speaking, because we who are your servants are listening. We pray this prayer in your son Jesus' name and say together, amen and
Amen.
amen. Amen. Tonight's topic to close out our series is David Walker and the appeal to the colored citizens of the world. If there's anyone within our lineage as AMEs who embodied the spirit of Black religion and Black radicalism, it would be a David Walker. And so I hope you all are ready for tonight's dialogue. We have with us as a dialogue partner, Dr. Christina Dickerson Cousin, who will share with us a presentation. I know that's a little bit different than the way that we have formatted it before, but I'm looking forward to this new way of engaging with you all tonight. Dr. Christina Dickerson Cousin is the daughter of Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson, retired general officer of the AME Church, and Mary A.E. Dickerson. She grew up in Western Massachusetts with her 3 siblings, and she received the BA in history from Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia in 2004, summa cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa. During her junior year, she spent 1 semester studying abroad at the University of Warwick in Coventry, England. And then she entered the PhD program in history at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee in 2005 as a Harold Sterling Vanderbilt graduate scholar. She earned her MA in 2007 and completed her PhD in 2011. So Dr. Christina Dickerson Cousin is a brilliant young scholar who is more than equipped to handle the dialogue for us tonight. So welcome, welcome, welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So I'm going to turn the evening over to you, and Reverend Tashara Void will handle the slide deck for you.
Okay, so again, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be giving a presentation for the first part of our time together, and then there will be plenty of time afterwards to engage with the audience with any of your questions. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And you can go on to the next one. Those are just my introductory ones. Thank you so much. Okay, so first, just to introduce our topic for those who may not be familiar with who David Walker was. So he was born free in North Carolina in the late 1790s. So he had an enslaved father and a free mother, so he was born free. At some point, he moves to Charleston, South Carolina, and becomes associated with the AME Church there. As we know, around that time, that is when Denmark Vesey was organizing a slave rebellion in Charleston, which ultimately was discovered, and those who were a part of it were executed. And so after that, David Walker has to flee, and so he leaves Charleston and eventually finds himself in Massachusetts, in Boston specifically, where he became an outspoken voice for the abolitionist cause, the abolition of slavery. And he publishes this appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829 and later does a subsequent version in 1830. Part of why this is so important for our purposes here is that he devotes considerable time in this appeal to Richard Allen, talking about how much he respects him and really quoting him on the issue of colonization in Liberia. So I'll be, of course, talking about that more later on. So eventually, through a variety of, sometimes secret means, Walker was able to spread his appeal throughout the South. And as, white Southerners found out about it, they were very concerned and put a bounty on his head. Then he is found dead at his home in 1830. There has been, debate about exactly what happened. Some scholars believe he died of tuberculosis, but we still, debate that. But ultimately, he does pass in 1830. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to divide my presentation in 3 sections. So first, I'm going to give kind of a broader historical context for when he was writing this document, so we can, fully understand where he's coming from. Secondly, I'm going to talk a bit about the AME Church and its own abolitionist tradition. And then finally, I'll end with a focus on what David Walker says in his appeal about Richard Allen. Slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so for the first section, historical context. As I mentioned before, David Walker publishes this appeal in 1829 and then has a subsequent edition in 1830. So this was a very challenging period, to say the least, for African Americans. This is known as the antebellum period. As we know, this is a few decades before the Civil War. But of course, people at that time could not know that the Civil War was coming in a few decades. And so they were living in, this really challenging time, not knowing that emancipation would come in a few decades. Slide, please. Okay, so by the time we get to the year 1830, we can see the way the United States looks on the map highlighted here. By this time, the US population has increased to about 12.8 million people. And of that, about 2 million were enslaved African Americans, most of whom lived in the South. And while the majority of African Americans in the United States were enslaved and most lived in the South, you did also have about 300,000 free African Americans as well, some of whom lived in the South, others who lived in the North and other areas. So that's kind of the demographic layout that we're thinking about when we get to 1829, 1830. Slide, please. Okay, so as most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the types of labor that enslaved people were forced to do in the South involved cotton. So prior to this time, the United States, and when it was a colony, various colonies, they exported a lot of different kinds of cash crops: tobacco, rice, sugar. But by the time we get to this antebellum period, to 1830, really the dominant crop is becoming cotton. And so it's not as if people didn't know what cotton was before this time, but prior to the invention of the cotton gin, which made it easier and faster to process cotton, it was not deemed economically feasible to produce it. But after the cotton gin makes it easier to, process and produce this cotton, that is when you start to see a cotton boom. And so if you look on the map highlighted here on this slide, it shows the various export crops that were dominant at the time. And the purple, that represents where cotton was a dominant export. And you can see throughout the lower South that this is where so much of this cotton was produced. And as a result, that is where a lot of the wealth in the United States was produced, but all on the backs of the uncompensated labor of enslaved African Americans. Okay, next slide, please. So in order to continue to provide a workforce for the Cotton Kingdom, In this period, African Americans are being transported from the upper South, places like Virginia, to the lower South, to places like South Carolina and Georgia, where cotton becomes the dominant crop. And so this forced migration is what historians call the second Middle Passage. So the first Middle Passage, of course, was the forced transport of Africans from the African continent to the Americas. But the second Middle Passage refers to the forced migration of African Americans from the upper South to the lower South, all in the effort to produce this cotton that is becoming so lucrative. On a personal note, my own ancestor, Melinda Wise, she was forcibly a part of this second Middle Passage. She was taken from Virginia and forced to go to South Carolina. And I would hazard a guess that many of your ancestors had to take a similar forced passage. So this period of really disruption of families, of forced migration, of this really, heinous period of the antebellum South. That is the context in which David Walker is writing his appeal. That's the context in which he is living. Next slide, please. As we know, African Americans always found ways to resist their bondage. Resistance could take the form of, work slowdowns, feigning illness, burning buildings, or just simply running away. We have, many, many examples of documents in newspapers of masters trying to retrieve those who have run away from their plantations. And so many ways to resist. But by the time we get to 1830, there have also been several documented cases of slave revolts and attempted slave revolts. Some examples include the Stono Rebellion, which occurred in South Carolina, Gabriel's planned revolt in Virginia in 1800, and of course, Denmark Vesey's revolt in 1822, which ultimately doesn't manifest. Interestingly, shortly after Walker's appeal came out, that is when you see the most famous slave revolt in U.S. history, the Nat Turner Rebellion. So African Americans have always resisted their bondage, and these are some of the ways in which they did so. So again, that context is important to keep in mind when talking about David Walker. Okay, next slide, please. But it's also at this time that you see the formal organization of the abolitionist movement. So there have always been people opposed to slavery. African Americans in particular have been, abolitionists for a long time. But it's really in this period that they form an organized movement. And abolitionists include a variety of people, some whose names we know, some whose names we do not. Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, Angelina Grimke, and many, many, many others. And abolitionists, they took many forms. Some are the folks who are helping people on the Underground Railroad. So for that reason, we may not know their names because they deliberately kept themselves secret. Others were publishing newspapers and pamphlets and petitions, people like David Walker. And as you can imagine, their actions greatly angered white Southerners who felt that they were undermining what they considered their way of life, both economically, socially, and politically. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's just some general historical context so we can understand how David Walker, what his experiences were and how he was coming to these ideas. So now a bit about the AME Church and abolitionism. From the beginning, the AME Church was an anti-slavery institution. There was always an understanding that slavery was a moral evil that should be eradicated. Richard Allen, as we know, had been enslaved. He had those experiences. Other early African Methodists had been enslaved and understood those experiences. And so it should be no surprise then that when the AME Church is officially established in 1816, that there is a strong abolitionist bent to the organization. And we need look no further for evidence of that than the very first AME discipline, which contained unequivocal language about slavery. And we'll look at that on the next slide, please. Okay, so in section 5 of the very first AME discipline, you see, question, What shall be done for the extermination of slavery? Answer: we will not receive any person into our society as a member who is a slaveholder, and any who are now members that have slaves and refuse to emancipate them after notification being given by the preacher having the charge shall be excluded. So, in no uncertain terms, slavery is moral evil, it is wrong. We will not accept anyone who owns slaves into our society, into our organization. Okay, next slide. Another way that we can see the abolitionist bent imbued in the AME Church from the beginning is none other than Sarah Allen, who was the second wife of Bishop Richard Allen. So she, of course, I'm sure we all are familiar with her. She becomes the mother of the church. And whereas she could have just enjoyed that position and the safety it might have brought her, instead, she chose to use her position to aid those who were fleeing slavery, anyone who reached her door in Pennsylvania. So if we go to the next slide. So this is an excerpt from her obituary in which it talks about how she assisted those who were seeking their freedom. So as it says, the poor flying slave, trembling and panting in his flight, has lost a friend not easily replaced. Her purse to such, as well as others, was ever open, and the fire of those eyes, now closed in death, kindled with peculiar brightness, as she would bid them Godspeed to the land of liberty, where the slave is free from his master, and the voice of the oppressor is no longer heard. So she was someone who aided those who were fleeing from slavery. She would give them money, she would protect them. And so again, showing the abolitionism inherent in the AME Church. Next slide, please. So AMEs also displayed their anti-slavery activism in more overt ways. So as we referred to, and as I'm sure you're familiar, Denmark Vesey in 1822 organized a slave revolt in Charleston, South Carolina. And although that was ultimately unsuccessful, it still showed the clear willingness to fight for and put his life on the line for the cause of abolition. So these are just some of the ways we see how the AME Church functioned in terms of its abolitionism. Additionally, if you'll go to the next slide, AMEs played an important role on the Underground Railroad. As we know, the Underground Railroad was a network of, safe houses, churches, basements, all throughout the country, where those who were seeking their freedom could hide for the night until they could get to the next station and the next station until they reached the north. So, for example, the noted abolitionist Reuben Ruby, he became affiliated with the AME Church in Portland, Maine. He ran essentially a taxi stand. You can see an image here on the right of what that would have looked like. And he would use that to help runaways. He would, help disguise them and help spirit them away using this means. In addition to that, AME churches also served as stations on the Underground Railroad. Next slide, please. For example, the church that I grew up in, Israel AME Church in Albany, New York, was a station on the Underground Railroad. So I took this quotation from the website of Israel AME Church. The present church was designed and built between 1845 and 1854. The church served as a station on the Underground Railroad throughout the Civil War, assisting enslaved people in their struggle for freedom and freed men and women in their spiritual struggle. Harriet Tubman slept in the church and Frederick Douglass spoke in it. So many ways that the AME Church is associated with the abolitionist movement. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so all of that to say that it should be no surprise then, given that rich history, given that context, given the abolitionist fervor within the denomination, that David Walker found much to respect about Richard Allen. So let's talk about his appeal itself. So I have a copy right here. There are many copies available today. So David Walker's appeal is divided into 4 sections. The first section is Our Wretchedness and Consequence of Slavery, in which he talks about, that very subject and how challenging it is for African Americans, how poorly they are treated. Article 2 talks about our wretchedness in consequence of ignorance. And in this section, he talks about how, there's obviously a conscious effort to keep African Americans from learning, how that has spilled into the way African Americans feel about themselves. He gives an example out of Kentucky, I believe it was, where some African Americans had been able to escape. And then one of the women who was a part of the group trying to escape ended up helping one of their captors. And so he says this is an evidence of how, deeply ingrained this ignorance is, that here she is trying to make it to freedom, and here she is helping her captor. So then Article 3 discusses our wretchedness in consequence of the preachers of the religion of Christ. And so he really highlights the hypocrisy of Christians saying that, we believe so deeply in Jesus Christ, but yet they're behaving this way. Christians saying we want to be missionaries in other countries and teach them the ways of Christianity, and yet they are treating African Americans this way. And then finally, in Article 4, he discusses our wretchedness in consequence of the colonizing plan. And here he talks specifically about the efforts to colonize the West African nation of Liberia. So it's not new by the time we get to this point, this idea of African Americans really not having a future in the United States. And so some people's solution to that is migrating back to Africa. So already for decades, the colony of Sierra Leone has been in place, and African Americans had, gone there. And so now the interest is in sending African Americans to Liberia. So he discusses how he views that as the wrong way to go. And this is the context in which he talks about Richard Allen. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's look specifically at what Walker says about Richard Allen. So it's important to note that at the time he is writing this, Richard Allen is still alive. He's about 69 years old at this point. And in addition to just saying many positive things about Richard Allen, he also reprints and discusses a letter that Allen wrote for the Freedom Journal, an abolitionist newspaper that Walker was a part of. And he really quotes and cites Allen and Allen's opposition to colonization in Liberia. So on the next slide, we're going to see some examples of that. Okay, is there any way to make that section a little bigger? If not, I'll just, because I wanted the audience to be able to see it. Okay, sorry, it's a bit small, but basically in this letter, Richard Allen is talking about how he opposes the plan of colonization to Liberia. He says, number one, why should we leave? We have put in our literal blood, sweat, and tears into this country. We didn't ask to come. This didn't start out as our home country, but it's our home country now. We are from Africa, but at this point, we've been in this country for generations. So why should we be the ones to leave? Additionally, he points out, and Walker kind of sides with him on this, that this is all sort of a nefarious plot, not really to free any people, but to provide a venue to get rid of free Blacks. He argues that the fact that free Blacks are walking around in the South and, living their lives, that white slave owners see that as a threat. That do we really want free Blacks showing what people are capable of? Do we really want them influencing our slaves? No, the solution is to get rid of them and send them over to Africa, and then we don't have to worry about them. So Allen points out, and Walker agrees with him, that that is part of the motivation for this goal of colonizing Liberia, and so he's opposed to it. Then if you could go to the next slide. So again, sorry, this is a bit too small, but here, Walker continues to talk about his feelings on the idea of colonization. He also talks in really laudatory terms about Richard Allen, the organization that he established, what it stands for. And he says, really when historians, write the history books, they will be talking about, the great work of Richard Allen. He's someone who everyone can and should emulate. he and his ministers are traveling throughout New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. They were in the South, but then they were kicked out. But they are, spreading their organization. They're bringing hope and, a future to so many African Americans. And really, the name of Richard Allen should go down as, being hugely consequential for African Americans in this country. Okay. So I'll actually stop it there. And that hopefully gives sort of an overview of what we're talking about here. And now I'd be more than happy to engage in dialogue and answer any questions.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for all of the time and energy you put into preparing an outline for us and preparing a dialogue for us. One of the things that I really appreciated about your sharing is how you made very clear the relationship that David Walker had with the AME Church and many of our pioneering leaders. That there wasn't just an independent theology, but that there was a theology he held that was cultivated by the AME Church, that was cultivated by his spiritual experience and his religious experience as part of this institution. And that is what kind of served as a catalyst for his public facing ministry. So thank you for pointing that out. If you don't mind, I would love to hear you add some context. And actually, before I ask this question, I want to say to those who are watching with us across platforms, thank you so much for joining with us. I know tonight we were expecting to hear from the Dickerson family, but we had some last minute challenges, but we're grateful that we were able to secure Dr. Christina Dickerson for our time tonight. For just a moment, I want to take a pause to invite you all into a moment of communal participation through the ministry of giving. The Black Religion and Black Radicalism dialogue series has taken place across 6 to 8 weeks. And in this 6 to 8 weeks, we've had a production team and many things that must be taken care of in the background. And so we invite you all to support that work through giving. You can give using the link on the screen at https://ameced.com/giving. And you can find several ways to give via Givelify, Cash App, and so on to help support this work. We thank you all in advance for the gifts that you have shared and for the time that you have shared with us. Dr. Dickerson, if you don't mind, I would like to hear from you a little bit more about your thoughts regarding the theology that helped to undergird the work that David Walker is doing. I heard you talk about his relationship with the AME Church and many of the pioneers, but a little bit more about what biblical references are building this theology, or what theologies he's naming specifically. So he may be talking about a lower Christology, a God that doesn't just sit high and look low, but a God who is present as Emmanuel, God with us. What types of things can you find in David Walker's work that speak to his theology and offer us a theological framework for the work as well?
That's not quite my field of expertise, but he does discuss the Bible a great deal in the work. And a lot of what he does, especially in those early parts, is point out the hypocrisy of the way some white Christians interpret the Bible, and the way, honestly, if you are truly paying attention to what Jesus's message is, and you are on the side of the oppressed, how you can't look at it and say, yes, this is something we should be doing. He is, looking at, for example, the story of Moses, as we're all familiar with that. And he points out point by point how some white Christians would use that to make the case that, slavery, perhaps not so bad, it's biblical. But Walker is, of course, pointing out that no, there is a clear difference between how slavery was handled in the Bible, and ultimately, the Israelites are freed, versus the way we are treated. There is something uniquely perilous, uniquely cruel, uniquely evil about this American version of Christianity. And he certainly speaks to that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I um I want to know too, if in your research and in your studying of David Walker, if you saw any threads of this spirit of by any means necessary,
Oh, yeah.
that you might, and where you might hear that, where you might see that, and how you make reason of that in your mind, or justification for that in your mind. And the reason I ask that question is I think, especially coming out of or experiencing now Easter tide, this imagery of a suffering lamb, this imagery of humility, and a faith that says we turn the other cheek, whatever that means in interpretation for different people. How do we reconcile theologies of violence that we may find in the
Mhm.
work of folk like David Walker, and what many people may believe to be a more docile faith?
Now that's a brilliant question. So part of why David Walker was so terrifying to white slave owners is that he had a militant bent to what he is saying. So the abolitionist movement, although it was, a cohesive movement, a lot of people disagreed about how to go about creating freedom. Some people said we need to focus on moral suasion. If we just present our case, if we have people who have experienced slavery, tell you about how terrible it is, if we are publishing slave narratives like Frederick Douglass's and telling you how awful it is, that eventually people will say, okay, you're absolutely right. We need to end this system. But over time, as slavery remains, further and further entrenched, people say, well, look, we tried that. That's not working. We tried appealing to their higher morality. So we have to do something else. And David Walker doesn't say, let's go, go south and murder everybody today. He's saying that, look, we have a right to our humanity. We have a right to, seek our freedom. And if all the peaceful means do not work, we have a right to self defense. We have a right to defend ourselves. We have a right to protect our families. And if that is, in a physical manifestation, then that's what it is. But the point you bring up is so interesting. It's something I think about a lot, that when you think about the Nat Turner rebellion that happens shortly after Walker's appeal comes out, is there a justification for violence
Mhm.
when you are facing oppression? Is there a justification for, killing women and children when they are a part of a larger system that is oppressing you? Is that
Mhm.
fair? Is that reasonable? Is that theologically justified? And that is, the question that they were wrestling with at the time. And in many ways, it's a question we're still wrestling with today in the 21st century. What actions are merited? What actions are justified when fighting for your freedom? What actions are justified when you are trying to, bring down an oppressive system? And so Walker's work, to white slave owners, it seems the answer is, it's not justified. You have no right to, attack us in this way. But from his point of view, if someone is attacking you, if
Mhm.
someone is attacking your family, attacking your children, selling them away, then yeah, you have a right to defend yourself. And yeah, you have a right to protect those you love, just like anybody else would.
Mhm. Yeah, and in your opinion, what are some of the ways that we could, I suppose, analyze our current context to determine what's necessary? Not necessarily whether violence is necessary or not, but what at all is a necessary response? What are some of the things we might analyze in order to determine?
Well, I mean, it's a challenging question, because I think it's, on the one hand, it's easy for me to say from the, relative comfort and safety of the 21st century what people should have done, what they should not have done. I think when you are dealing with life and death issues, the protection of your family, it's it's hard to know what is right and wrong, but that is the exact issue that we as Christians have to reckon with. I think prayer, seeking God's voice, seeking what God wants you to do, that's always a positive place to start. Communal action, communal discussion of what needs to be done, all of that matters. All of those are things we should be certainly doing.
Mhm.
And we do have to question where we stand on, yeah, what is justified. And people can reasonably disagree, people can come to different conclusions, and especially people who are in that moment facing those life or death decisions, they may come to different conclusions than someone else. But certainly we have to really reckon with our faith. And if we believe, vengeance is mine, that our job is to, follow Jesus's message, follow his, way of being, and let God handle punishment, let God handle all of that. you know that is where some people come down on it. Others believe that, you have every right to protect yourself and defend yourself. So it's, I wish I had an easy answer, but
Mhm.
there isn't
Yeah.
really an easy answer to that. And I think reasonable people can disagree, and it's a challenge that certainly our ancestors faced. And it's a challenging issue, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I thank you for your response. I think you're right that there's no easy answer. There's no cookie cutter answer. It all depends on your context, and where you feel you're able to go. There's something that you pointed out, though, that I found to be pretty, I suppose, significant, and that is that we have to decide what it is that we believe and where we stand on particular issues. What's important to us as a connection, what's important to us as a people, before we can even begin to decipher how we might respond to an issue. Just figuring out where we stand on it, and what we believe about it. Is one. And then that piece you stated about being in communal dialogue, because I do think that a large part of the work that folk like David Walker was doing wasn't done in isolation, and it wasn't
Hmm.
done in a vacuum. It is a response to the collective wailing, the voice of God and the tears of the people, and the voice of God and the cries of the people that he is responding to. And so I
And
appreciate.
if I could just interject, you made me think of something that I wanted to point out. It's
Mhm.
also important that when you look at his appeal, he didn't say appeal to the colored citizens of the United States. He said appeal to the colored citizens of the world. So he
Yes,
is already trying to reference the idea of really Pan Africanism, that
yes.
it's not just the oppression that we are facing, it's the oppression in the United States, it's the oppression that is being faced all throughout the Americas. I mean, keep in mind that the Haitian Revolution has happened by this time.
Hmm.
So we have, right next door, a living, breathing example of a free Black republic.
Hmm.
And so you have to understand that that is part of his consciousness, that that is, the Haitian revolution, the Haitian citizens, they have to be a part of our conception too. This is about the colored citizens of the world, not just the colored citizens of the United States.
Hmm.
I'm sorry I
Yeah.
interrupted, I just wanted to remember to say that.
No, I actually think that's really important for you to name, especially because we're a connectional church. And
Right.
so I think in a lot of our earliest thinkers and earliest faith leaders, you see a leaning toward combating imperialism and combating violence across the globe. There is a recognition for our global consciousness. And so I think it's important that you mention that and that you bring that up, because it only goes to further support the idea that our earliest faith leaders and earliest thinkers were not just Bible readers. They were not just Sunday school goers, but they were people who were knowledgeable about the political climate that was taking place around them, not only here in the United States, but across the globe. There was a geopolitical consciousness that helped to inform the work. And for a lot of us, that is like beyond our ability to comprehend because we are so locally focused in our politics and our understanding. But what you said also reminded me of that quote that says, "None of us are free until we are all free." Howard Thurman even said, "None of us are saved until we are all saved." And
Right.
that includes our siblings who are across the globe. There is a global South, there is a global Black folk, there are global oppressed folk who are all fighting against the same forces that we fight against. And this is not a new issue, but one that folk like even David Walker understood.
And
Especially,
also,
go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
I just wanted to continue on a point that you just made. Um, one of the really important points that my father made in his work, The African Methodist Episcopal Church History, in chapter 1, is making the case for Richard Allen as an Atlantic world figure. That if you think about the world that Richard Allen lived in, there's no such thing as California when Richard Allen is alive. There's no such thing as, any of those states that are now in the far west. That wasn't
Mhm.
his world. His
Yeah.
world was the, Atlantic seaboard. It was the Caribbean.
Mhm.
It was Africa. It was Europe. That was his world. And
Yeah.
so he very much, from the beginning of his ministry and from the beginning of what we know about him, he was
Yeah.
thinking in an Atlantic world context. He may not have called it that, but that's what he was doing.
Yeah.
He always viewed the AME Church as going to be an Atlantic world institution. Again, he may not have used that terminology, but certainly
Mhm.
that's what he was doing. I actually make that point as well in my book about how it shouldn't be a surprise that early on in his ministry, early on in the foundations of the AME Church, you see indigenous Americans, you see
Mhm.
Native
Yeah.
people who are a part of the AME Church. It surprises us, but it shouldn't, because Allen had a more expansive view than sometimes we do today.
Mhm.
He always viewed us as an institution for the oppressed people of color throughout the world. This isn't just about us right here. It's about this larger, these larger colored citizens of the world.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I love it. And thank you for sharing that. As we sort of start working our way toward closing this conversation, I want to bridge the gap between what was and what is now, what history we're studying, and the context we're currently living through. So, if you could, just in your opinion, what are some of the ways that David Walker was able to engage in his work that we can emulate, whether it be through study or through praxis? What are some of the ways that you can identify as a paralleled opportunity for doing the work of the Lord in the public sphere?
Well, excellent question. For one, I would say, and I'm constantly sort of amazed by this, his fearlessness.
Mm,
And especially when you study early AME history, you get an appreciation for how brave these people were. I
yeah.
mean, we have the benefit of knowing how it all ends, knowing that the Civil War is coming, knowing that emancipation is coming. They couldn't know that in 1830. And so he was very brave. I mean, one of the things he did is, from Boston. So he had a clothing shop. So he would, sew copies of his pamphlet into sailors' clothing,
Mhm,
have the sailors put it on. And then as they traveled south, that's how they would disseminate the pamphlet. I mean, not only is that ingenious, but that's also brave. I mean, they put a
mhm,
bounty on this man's head. And
mhm,
so the fearlessness with which he was willing to speak truth to power, his focus on getting to the oppressed in the South. It would have been very easy for him just to say, well, I made it north. I'm safe. I'm free. Best of luck to you all. But he was committed to getting that message to the people who needed to hear it down South. And I think we can certainly employ that kind of ingenuity and that kind of bravery. Also, something I'm usually on a soapbox about is he wrote things down. He took the time, he put forth the effort to think about these complex issues and put them down in a work that we still have today. And that's something that we take for granted, but we shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I find endlessly, wonderful about early AME history, and AME history today as well, is that they believe that what they were doing was critically important. How do you know they thought it was important? Because they wrote it down.
Mm-hmm.
They had and printed their annual conference minutes. They printed their general conference minutes. That David Walker, printing this pamphlet, because he said it's not only for us today, it is for remote posterity. So one day they can know that we didn't
Yeah.
just sit down and allow this to happen. We didn't just sit
Yeah.
down and not say anything. I want to be on the record that this is what I have to say. And I think we can, certainly take advantage of that. We have, many more means, to express ourselves, through social media and everything else. And while that's important, it's also important to really reckon with the issues of the day and write serious works about the issues of the day. Facebook is great. Twitter is great. I know I'm old. I'm talking about Facebook, but Facebook is great. I know, and that's great to write down your thoughts there. But who's going to be able to find those 10 years from now? Who's going to find your tweets 10 years from now, 20 years from now? No one's going to be able to find those. Write it down in a serious way. Really reckon with these issues and write thoughtful, serious works. And many AME scholars are doing that. Young scholars are doing that. So I would just encourage us to take, David Walker's mantle and, reckon with these issues and, write serious works on them that can be preserved so that you and we can be on record for having reckoned with these issues, having a deep belief in them, and having them available for our posterity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I love it. I love it. And I especially love what you said about their bravery, because the work that they were doing was being done at a time where, and this is me loosely quoting you, they had no idea that emancipation was coming.
Right.
Uh, and I appreciate that you pointed that out, because many people didn't know that the emancipation was coming. But for some of our earlier leaders, individual emancipation had already come, and they refused to leave their siblings behind. They refused to
Wonderful.
let that be the end of the fight. And so I'm grateful that you pointed that out. And I would only add that they had the audacity to ask for more. And I think that the same must be true for us, that there is never too big of an ask when the ask is our freedom, that there is never too big a dream when the dream is a world where there is justice and there is equity and there is holistic health and wellness for all of God's children. And there's access to the abundance that God has already provided for all of God's children. And so I only add to what you said, that while emancipation may not be a global phenomenon, it may not be a national phenomenon, but if I can experience it as an individual, then I know that there is more after this. I know that there's more for not only me, but for the whole of my community. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and sharing your knowledge with our connection tonight. I'm grateful for the time that you have shared with us. And I'm grateful to all of you who have decided to share this time and space and to trust us to share the knowledge that we have gleaned over the years. I hope that tonight is just the beginning of you all study. I hope that tonight is just an addition to the work that you're already doing in your communities, and that you will continue to have some of these conversations in your local church congregations, your conferences, and maybe on your district level. I invite you all to speak to each other in the chat box. You can return to the AME Church Christian Recorder or AMEC Publishing House YouTube pages or Facebook pages to go back to any of the videos throughout this series, as tonight is our closing night. Thank you so much to all of you who have been journeying with us from the beginning, and to all of you, I'll see you back here in June, where we will do a special session on South Carolina and Denmark Vesey and Mother Emmanuel. I'll see you all then. Thank you again, and have a good night, family.